A few years back, I started a retrospective on the Mega Man X games, going from the Maverick Hunter's beginnings to its adventures on the PlayStation 2, and rewatching them on my external hard drive made me want to put them into one big compilation for your viewing pleasure. And I thought it'd be a fun trip down memory lane to see how I've changed throughout these last few years as a writer. I put timestamps for each game, but if you've already seen them and want something new, I've also included a couple of exclusive reviews I didn't touch before, so get yourself some snacks and a drink, preferably coffee, and enjoy. Not too long ago, I did a voting poll on my Twitter page asking my viewers on the next series of reviews I should do, and the winner was the Mega Man X games. My first experience with the Mega Man franchise was around the late 90s with X4 on my family PC, and I remember watching a few episodes of NT Warrior on Fox Kids around the 2000s. But I wasn't a Blue Bomber fanatic until the Screw Attack days talking about their love for the series. Me and my brothers downloaded Mega Man 2, 3 and the new at the time Mega Man 9 on the Nintendo Wii, and it was then I properly got into the series. I really enjoyed the classic Mega Man games, but my experience with the X sub-series is only the first 4 games, so I'm looking forward and terrified at getting at the rest of the series. Up first is the original Mega Man X, which is considered by many not only one of the best Mega Man games, but one of the best Super Nintendo games, as well as one of the best 2D platformers of all time. I would be playing the X series through the Legacy Collection, which at the time are probably the most accessible, but the first game is available through the original Super Nintendo, the Mini, and the Wii U and new 3DS eShops. There is also the PSP remake Maverick Hunter X, which adds a few new bells and whistles, but for this review I will mostly be focusing on the original game. While we got to see many series like Mario and Ghosts and Goblins advance to the 16-bit generation, it took the Blue Bomber a little longer to make that jump, as he was still tin on the NES. The development team at Capcom wanted to make the transition more extreme, with a darker and radical story, which at the time was the popular thing to do in entertainment. That was the 90s for you, and in some cases, it still lives on. Series veteran Kenji Inafune even drastically changed the Blue Bomber's design that eventually became Zero. Instead, the redesign came down to another Mega Man veteran, as well as the Battle Network character designer Hayato Kaji, which from an evolution of the character, Hayato did a better job at designing. Compared to its predecessor, the X series puts more emphasis on story. During Dr. Thomas Light's final days, he created Mega Man X, who had the potential to become the ultimate robot with human-level intelligence and the ability of free will. Wait, so I'm guessing the OG had no free will then? Dr. Light then put X into hibernation for the next 30 years for diagnostics, to be sure that X would be used for peace. Many years later, after Light's death, X is discovered by archaeologist Dr. Kane, who then studied Light's research and X himself to mass-produce robots named Reploids. Unfortunately, if you read or watch a majority of stories that center around robots, a lot of them go violent, resulting in them becoming Mavericks. To counter the violent robots and bring order, Kane forms the Maverick Hunters. One of Kane's creations and former leader of the Hunters, Sigma, one day decides to go rogue and recruits 8 Mavericks into his army to wipe out the human race, and it's up to X and Zero to stop him. Most of the story details are in the game's manual and the OVA film Day of Sigma, which is in the PSP remake and the X Legacy Collection. Bear in mind though, some of the story details like Dr. Kane's death is only in the Day of Sigma story and Maverick Hunter X, which is most likely in its own continuity, as Kane does appear in the next game. Besides that though, X's origin and the story summary is the same. While the story is more involved, the actual game only features a few cutscenes, which you don't have to pay much attention to, especially if you played this game a good number of times. While the series got a new coat of paint, The goal is pretty much the same. Defeat the 8 Mavericks in any order and give Sigma a good arse kicking. X is able to gain weapons from the bosses too, which the majority of them are dead, and thanks to the Super Nintendo with its good number of buttons, you can switch between weapons on the fly, instead of pressing pause every time you want to switch. The shotgun ice scatters into many pieces when it hits a wall, which is good at hitting airborne enemies. The Storm Tornado is a powerful weapon that can kill many bosses like this into dust within seconds. Some of them have uses outside of combat too, like the Boomerang Tracker, which is used to grab heart pieces and energy tanks, and the Chameleon Sting, when fully charged with an upgrade, can make X completely invulnerable for a tiny bit, which is a lifesaver in the first Sigma stage. The Mavericks are also weak to certain weapons. No, the bosses are perfectly fine to fight against with the Buster alone. When you beat a certain Maverick, not only will you get that Maverick's power, but some of the stages will change too. For example, Flame Maverick stage is usually covered in lava, but if you beat Teal Penguin stage prior, then the lava will be frozen solid, allowing you to move across the frozen lava and pick up the heart piece. There are some other stages that change too depending on the Maverick you defeat, making each playthrough feel different. I love it, and I hope future titles will keep this design. X is able to get armor upgrades for each body part by going in the Dr. Light capsules. There are the helmet, which can break certain blocks as well as protect him from foreign objects. The torso, which halves damage by half. The arm cannon, which makes X's charge shot stronger as well as giving your special weapons new moves. And finally, the game changer, the boost shoes. There is also another ability, the Hadouken, from Capcom's other popular series, Street Fighter, which can one-shot the majority of bosses as long as you're perfectly healthy. This was an Easter egg back in the day of its release, so the requirement was meant to be hidden, but the way to get it is still absurd, as you're supposed to get every power up, go to the end of Armored Armadillo stage, and commit Seppuku numerous times till you get it. The boots, along with the ability to walk it, is what makes Mega Man X so much fun, as it provides high-speed action and platforming that go hand in hand with the other designs. Since the screen no longer transitions from one screen to another, besides the boss doors, the movement feels nice and fast-paced, with a lack of interruptions. While I love the ability to dash, I would say unlike the armor upgrades that you can ignore and still beat the game, the boots are mandatory, and I highly suggest going to Teal Penguin stage first to get them. Otherwise, fighting the rest of the Mavericks will be hard, and the majority of the collectibles require you to at least have them on. If you're going for a weakness order, then Teal Penguin is the recommended choice, and isn't an issue. But I would assume that first timers who are unaware of the boss order would put somebody like Storm Eagle first and may struggle. Apparently, this was to get veteran Mega Man players to adjust to the new game gradually, but I think the best way to do this is to obtain the boots at the end or somewhere in the middle of the tutorial stage. Unlike X's older brother, he starts off with a very small amount of health, and instead needs to get heart pieces like the Zelda and Metroid games to increase it. This may seem stupid to nerf the hero, while it was perfectly fine in the previous titles just to have some collectibles, but as someone who plays stuff like Metroid and RPGs, I'm fine with this decision. Around the time of X's release, RPGs were a popular genre in Japan, so the team were inspired by the genre and wanted to add visual elements of showing the player's experience throughout the adventure, and this was by adding armor upgrades, heart pieces, and sub-tanks. Instead of the one and done energy tanks, there are now 4 sub-tanks that can be reused numerous times by picking up health from dead corpses. Think of it like energy tanks as a can of Coke, and sub-tanks as canisters that can be refilled as many times as you like. I prefer the way Mega Man X handles gaining your health back. As someone who enjoys RPGs, I like the idea of starting out weak but gradually getting stronger, becoming a force to be reckoned with. And while Mega Man X is a platformer at heart, the way it tells its story through gameplay, it gives off a similar vibe to an RPG. You don't start off with much besides the standard shots, and you will get your ass kicked by Vile in a forced boss fight, but by the end game, you mop the floor on the dude and surpass your superior Zero. Mega Man X isn't anything deep, but it's at least engaging. The Mega Man series is well known for its music, especially amongst retro fans. Heck, Mega Man's name in Japanese is Rockman. It was named after the rock genre. They even knew that the music is fantastic. Mega Man X's soundtrack is just as good too, giving off the rock and roll vibe, intimidating electric guitar riffs, and it's thanks to these talented musicians. There are plenty of amazing tunes, such as Chill Penguin stage, Spark Mandrill stage, and the opening level stage, but my absolute favourite is Storm Eater stage, which got stuck in my head a few times. While it took the Blue Bomber a little while to jump to the Super Nintendo, as well as going for a slightly darker tone, it was a successful one, and I can see why, as Mega Man X is an excellent 2D platformer that remained true to the series formula that improved on some of the limitations of its predecessors. I can see why so many people claim to be one of the best Super Nintendo games, as well as some of their favourites. I will definitely put it up there as one of the best games on that system too. With about a year after its release, Capcom released the sequel, Mega Man X2, which is going to be my next review, so I hope you stick around for it. Take care, and have a wonderful day. Not too long ago, I reviewed the original Mega Man X, and now it's time to get into and discuss the sequel, Mega Man X2, released just a year from the original. The first Mega Man X title is praised as one of the most beloved 2D platformers, which overshadows Mega Man X2 in popularity, selling less than the original's 1.16 million copies. Even today, a Super Nintendo copy is a lot more expensive to purchase online, thanks to its exclusive CX4 graphics chip that was only used for this game and the Super Nintendo version of X3. Thankfully now it's available for the X Legacy Collection, which is way cheaper. So, how is Mega Man X2? And is it as good as its predecessor? Let's find out. The story begins 6 months after Sigma's defeat from the first game. The Maverick Hunters are raiding a Maverick base, which are mass-producing mechanicoids. Afterwards, we see the brains of the operation, the X-Hunters, who are analysing X's abilities and resurrecting Sigma, while sending out 8 Mavericks to distract our hero. As X defeats 2 of the 8 Mavericks, the Hunters become worried that their troops won't be enough to stop him, so they decide to bargain and challenge X in a one-on-one fight in exchange for Zero's body parts, who sacrificed himself in the first game. Compared to the first game, where most of the story was in the game's manual, Mega Man X's 2 story is easier to digest thanks to more cutscenes telling you what is happening in the moment. Unlike Sigma, who only appears at the end, and Vile, who only appears twice in the original, the X-Hunters are more involved as villains, who appear throughout the story, and I do think it's cool that you can fight the villains in the fortress stages instead of just fighting some random bosses like the first game. The subplot of Zero's body I feel makes the story more personal towards our main character, since he has a chance to bring his body back to life. The X-Hunters and searching for Zero's body parts is what makes X2 different from X1. When you defeat 2 of the 8 Mavericks, the X-Hunters will come into action and scatter across the remaining stages. The X-Hunters sound interesting in theory, adding replay value, but there are some issues with this feature. From what I can tell in my multiple playthroughs of the game, I'm not sure if they had a specific order, or they just teleported to any random stage, but I felt it can distract you if you were going for a boss weakness playthrough. While it's hard to judge which stage they would teleport to, they have their own unique room in each stage. The rooms themselves aren't hard to find, but there are a couple of cases where you can't access these rooms if you don't have the correct power or armor part. If you only have 2 Mavericks remaining and don't have a single zero part, then you won't be able to get them all, yachting you out of one of the outcomes. The fights against them are alright for the most part. Now, Agile can be easily defeated if you get him into a pattern of repeating the same S-Gas attack, and Ryan's Ball and Chain attack can be difficult to read. If you beat an X-Hunter, then you gain a zero body part. The main issue I have with getting Zero's body part is that no matter if you fight the X-Hunters or not, the outcome of the finale barely changes. If you get all of Zero's parts, then you bring back your red comrade from the grave. But if you don't, then it doesn't really matter as the bad guys bring him back for you. You just have to knock some sense into your body in a boss fight. The actual ending is the same no matter what you do. It's not a big issue, but I feel less inclined fighting the X-Hunters in the future. The former writer and producer of the Mega Man X series, Kenji Inafune, really liked Zero, so he insisted the staff should bring them back for the sequel. I think that Hunters should have been available in all 8 stages, no matter which of the 2 Mavericks he defeated, but let the player explore to find their unique rooms without worrying about boss orders and the Hunter's random patterns. I think making the outcome have a huge impact, depending if you found the parts or not, would help too. Like, if you don't go out your way to explore, then Zero will remain dead. It would give the sense for the player to go the extra mile while rewarding them with an emotional scene. Maybe at least give X a new ability or a new stage to go through if the X-Hunters are defeated before the Fortress stages. Besides that, the core gameplay is similar to X1, so if you're going from that game to this one, it would be a smooth transition. You still get new powers from defeating the 8 bosses and gain new armor parts. The selection of Maverick fights were mostly enjoyable, with each of them being defeatable without using their weakness. In fact, there were times where I found the Buster to be more useful than the weakness weapons themselves. Like, if you use Will Gator's weakness, the Strike Chain, he will reset his pattern and dive into that bloody pool, making you wait till he comes back up. Some of the Mavericks even have a second phase during their boss fights, like Moth, who starts out in a cocoon, throwing junk at you, but then emerges into a moth halfway through with a new set of attacks. I would say some bosses like Will Gator and Crystal Snail do take a while to fight, since they have moves that slow down the pace. Snail even charges the frame rate a bit with its slow down ability that has a wave effect in the foreground. Thankfully, this time around, the Dassus are available from the start, instead of being unlocked, so you don't have to worry much about boss orders, unlike the next one. Instead, the armor parts have new functions. The suit upgrade now allows Mega Man to dash in midair, which is pretty cool, and isn't mandatory if you just want to play a standard run. The torso armor cuts the damage by half, like in the original, but has a new ability called the Digger Crush attack, a screen nuke that kills all minor enemies on the screen. It can only be refilled by getting hit by enemies, and besides one boss, I barely used it. Still, it's a nice addition to the torso upgrade. The headpiece now stands for seated areas, which is useful for first timers. The downside is that the stander is not automatic, meaning you would have to know where to stand, plus you cannot attack while you stand, making you totally defenseless. It would have been so much useful if the stand was automatic, making a beeping sound where you found a secret location while still being able to attack. Still, compared to the headpiece in X1, that doesn't get much action, X2's headpiece was reliable around the time when internet access wasn't as common compared to today. The best upgrade now is the armor upgrade, which now lets Mega Man store an automatic second charge slot if you fully charge your first attack. This makes good work against the majority of the enemies and the bosses. In fact, it's a bit too good, as it overshadows a lot of the new power-ups. Some of the new powers are useful, like the Speed Burner, which grants Mega Man a new air dash attack, and the Bubble Splash, which becomes one of the best sealed weapons in the entire series. but there are some that I only use for situational purposes, like Crystal Snail's Crystal Hunters, that turns enemies into platforms. We also have another Street Fighter move, which is 10 signature move, the Soryuken, which has the same command motions from its origin series. The Soryuken does loads of damage, but unlike the Hadouken, it doesn't immediately kill the bosses and leaves you wide open after the attack. It's also only available in the third fortress stage, near the very end, where you can only use it in the last 3 stages, one of them being the traditional boring Mega Man boss rush, and the other being the final boss. The way to get it is very challenging, but at least you don't have to kill yourself numerous times. The Soryuken is cool, but it's not something I would go after in future runs. If you could have gotten it a little bit earlier, it would have been so much cooler. I really enjoyed the other design in X1, easing classic fans into the 16-bit generation. So with X2, the designers had the chance to expand on the other designs and Mega Man's arsenal without wearing marks of staring players, since most people would have probably played the first game first. The levels are designed much more with the dash and war capability in mind, as the game expects you to learn and master them throughout your journey, especially if you want to find the collectibles. The collectibles aren't hard to find for the most part, if you go out your way exploring, but there are 1 or 2 instances where the collectibles can be a bit too hidden. For example, in Morph Moth stage, you need to use Will Gator's weapon on a specific floor, then it's similar to any normal floor, to get an armor upgrade, and without using a helmet or a guide, then you will probably have no idea where to look. I had to admit I did get up a guide to find an armor piece in my first ever playthrough. There are some cool novel designs, like in Wire Sponges stage, where the weather changes from rain to a heat wave that affects the enemies and Mega Man. Overdrive Ostrich's stage introduces the first ever bike section in the X series, which is fun, though the controls need some adjustments, as the turns feel a bit sluggish. The level themes are diverse, ranging from a scorching desert, an erupting volcano, and a lovely crystal cave, and the effects are much more noticeable, giving some of these stages life, like the sandstorm in the desert stage and the weather effects in Wire Sponges stage. The CX4 chip was one of the selling points for this game, which was used for mapping and transforming the wireframes seen in the Tiger Stream and 2 bosses. It was one of the reasons why the game was, and still is, expensive. Around the 90s, many developers were testing out 3D technology, and when Mega Man X2 came out in Japan, the PlayStation was already out. But still, the wireframe effects probably blew somebody's mind back in the day. I would say out of any IP Capcom had around the time, it did suit Mega Man the best, with its science fiction theme. It probably won't impress anyone today now. Unlike X1's many composers, only Yuki Iwai, who did Steel Penguin's theme, returned. And, well, there are some good tracks like Crystal Snails, Bubble Crab stage, as well as the first Fortress stage, but I feel some of them feel too short and repetitive, like Will Data stage. It's a shame because her work on many arcade Capcom fighters are great. Some people expect big changes to a sequel, and that isn't always the case. I do think it's a shame that X2 doesn't get much praise compared to the original, but I guess some people aren't usually excited the second time around. I'm not sure which Mega Man X game I prefer out of the 2, but Mega Man X2 is still an amazing game. I prefer the way the story is told here, and the Maverick fights I think are better here too, but going after the X Hunters to TX0's parts, I found to be disappointing, without much reason to go after them, and I do slightly miss the other changes that happened in X1. If you enjoy Mega Man X, then I think you would most likely enjoy Mega Man X2, but if you decide to play it, please get it on the X Legacy TXN, or the TXN on the 6th generation consoles if you're American, as the original copy is damn expensive. If you played Mega Man X2, let me know what you think of the game, and I hope you stick around because the next Mega Man game I will be tackling is Mega Man X3. So far, the Mega Man X games have been incredibly fun platformers, and now we're on the next installment and the last one to be released on the Super Nintendo. Mega Man X3, released in 1995 in Japan and 1996 in the West. Unlike the first two games that were developed internally by Capcom, this one was outsourced by Minakuchi Engineering, who worked on the Game Boy titles, as well as the Wire Wars on the Sega Mega Drive. My guess is most of the internal staff were probably working on the next installment for the newest console generation at the time. Is Mega Man X3 a good climax to the Super Nintendo trilogy? Let's find out. The game starts off with a skippable introduction showing the events after X2. A scientist named Dr. Doppler has supposedly created a cure to prevent Reploids from going berserk and builds a utopia known as Doppler Town. However, none of that really matters, as in the same scene we find out that the Reploids in the town go Maverick, causing a riot, with Dr. Doppler being the one who caused this incident. We later find out that Dr. Doppler is being corrupted by Sigma, who is back from the dead. Again, this will be a recurring theme in the X series, just like Wily in the classic games, though it does address why he keeps coming back due to now being a computer virus. Still, I'm not a fan of seeing him in every game. As for Doppler, they just switched him from being a good guy to bad guy immediately in just one scene, with that scene being the introduction scene. It would have been nice if the game built him up to be the main villain throughout the game, rather than outing him to be the villain from the beginning. At its core, Mega Man X3 plays like the former two games, with the 8 bosses and collecting powers from them. Mega Man controls practically the same too, with some neat armor parts. The boots in X2 gave him an air dash, but X3 takes it further, as now he can either do that or double jump if he needs to, and with a special armor at the end, he can do both. The helmet got a bit of an improvement from the previous title. In X3, the helmet now automatically creates a map of the stage you're in and highlights the power-ups that are in the stage. However, it is only used at the start of the stage and can only be used once per stage, so make sure you have it memorized or take a screenshot. It does highlight what items you have collected and what is missing on the stage yet screen, which makes it easier for you to find them. Still, I would have preferred if the map was on the stage at all times, making sure where to find the items you're looking for, like in Super Metroid. While I think the majority of the armors got a bit of an upgrade, the arm cannon got the biggest nerf. While the Chancellor upgrade was a bit too good, it was still great to use and proved useful throughout the adventure. The arm cannon in X3 is more cumbersome to use than actually useful. You can fire 2 charge shots similar to X2, but if you fire at the same time, the shots will combine together to become a wall of blast, which is very slow and leaves X wide open for counterattacks, and in some cases enemies can even block the attack. The smaller shots above and below the middle of the charge shot barely hit anything too, at least when I was playing it. There are these paint capsules that can be found in the stages that give X an enhancement to one of his parts, like giving X the ability to do multiple air dashes, but do not get these. If you do, then you will be able to get the gold armor found in the Doppler stages, which grants X all 4 multiple enhancements instead of just the one you would have found in the pink capsule. You can only equip 1 pink capsule at a time, which makes finding them not worth it. When you go out of your way to explore in any video game, you are often rewarded for your curiosity and your skills, but in X3, this feels like the designers are punishing you for exploring. I think instead of waiting for the gold armor, you would require to look for the 4 pink capsules, and once you do, you automatically get the gold armor. I found some of the powers from the Mavericks to be decent. I often use the Vase Spray Gun to attack enemies above me, and the Triad Thunder is a dual tool to attack enemies up close and used while traversing on the walls. It's such a shame then that these Mavericks are the worst I've experienced so far. They're either extremely easy as they reset their patterns when you use their weakness, or super frustrating to fight with just a buster. The majority of the bosses mostly just move back and forth too, instead of anything creative, and the worst thing is, you use the majority of your health if they just come into contact with you, making the beginning of X3 to be the worst part about this game. The best choice I found was going up against Blizzard Buffalo, as you get the dash boots in that stage, and he is also the easiest to exploit with the gears I found. Firstly, wall jump over him, then when he turns around, just jump and he will charge away from X, giving you the opportunity to shoot at him. Keep repeating this till he's dead. If the fight is a pain without using an easy exploit, then it's not a good fight to begin with. The only boss I enjoyed was fighting against Vile, who makes a comeback from X1. Vile is resurrected by Doctor, who seeks out blood. He can be fought in some of the Maverick stages, which you need to explore to find him. If you defeat him with his weakness, then he will be replaced with a different boss in the Doctor stages. If not, then he comes back with a new sweet ride. There are also two other bosses that can be found in the Maverick stages, Bit and Bite. Unlike Vile, Bit and Bite will appear at some point throughout your journey of beating the 8 Mavericks. Like Vile, if they are defeated with their weakness, you will fight a different boss near the end game. I don't care for the Bit and Bite bosses, as they feel the same as the Maverick fights, but I do like how it makes each playthrough feel different. They don't change the ending, but just makes things different when you want to play the game again. It's not only the bosses that do a lot of damage by content, as their common moots also do a stupid amount of damage. I know X1 and X2 have some enemies that respawn pretty quickly when you go on and off screen, but it's more noticeable in X3, and in the case of X3, the enemies seem to endure more of your shots, so making them respawn feels annoying. This is probably due to X3's biggest feature, Zero. This is the first time you can play as Zero, and he starts with a lot of health, and he can kill enemies faster with the ability to fire out 2 charge shots, as well as use his beam saber, but he has some downsides. For one, Zero gets outmatched by X by the later half of the game. He cannot pick up any heart tanks or E-tanks, and he cannot use the Maverick's powers. Besides the intro stage mid-boss and one other boss in the Doctor stages, he cannot fight any bosses, so if he sees a door that will lead to a fight, X would come in to handle it. X3 has a lot of mid-bosses, so there isn't much opportunity to use him, and you can only use them once per stage. If he dies at any time, then you cannot use Zero anymore, which locks you out of getting not just one of the best weapons in the game, but in the entire Super Nintendo trilogy. I didn't use him that much, besides using him as cannon fodder. The other big feature is the rideable mechs. In X1 and X2, the mechs were only used in a handful of areas, but in X3, they are part of the stuff to check, and there are about 4 different types. Like Zero, the mechs are interesting in theory, but they don't really add much, and are mostly used just to get other MacGuffins and even other mechs. The major downside is even if you have collected one mech item, you cannot summon it until you find one of the mechs in the Blast Hornet stage, which you cannot get until you go and beat Tunnel Rhino. Blast Hornet is also not a good choice to go after, unless if you have his weakness, and in one of my playthroughs, he was the last Maverick I went up against, so in those playthroughs there wasn't much opportunity to use it. I think the mechs could have been interesting if you didn't have to go to Blast Hornet stage first to unlock the ability to use them, and I wish they had their own alternate areas specifically designed for them, instead of just being used to find MacGuffins. The visuals looked just as good as the previous 2 games, with X3 using the same graphics chip as X2 for the same effects, but the music is a downgrade for me. Besides a couple of tracks like Gravity Beetle's theme, a lot of the tracks sound too similar and very repetitive. Mega Man X3 was also released on the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn, only in Japan and Europe, which featured animated cutscenes for the opening intro and the boss introductions, as well as a new arranged CD quality soundtrack composed by some of the X1 crew, which listening to is better, but it isn't something I would listen to if it wasn't for the review. If you're American, the only official way to play this is for the Xtreme on the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. Mega Man X3 had a lot of interesting ideas like the rideable mechs, the enhancement chips, and the playable Zero, but the majority of them had a lot of drawbacks. I hated the majority of the bosses, and the damage sponges that were the enemies made me not like the game at all. I wouldn't recommend playing Mega Man X3 unless if you had the Xtreme or the X Legacy Xtreme, and you were at least curious. I know I was at least curious myself when I picked up the Xtreme. Now that I've finished the Super Nintendo trilogy, it's time to jump onto the 5th generation of games with Mega Man X4. We have now left the Super Nintendo era of Mega Man X, and now jumping properly into the 7th generation of consoles with originally released on the Sega Saturn and PlayStation in 1997, and a little later on PCs. X4 was my introduction to the Mega Man franchise back in the late 90s, as I played it on my family's Windows 98 PC. However, I didn't play any Mega Man title until the Wii Shop days. My very first Mega Man game is also considered as one of the most popular in the X saga, alongside the original Mega Man X. While Mega Man X4 was certainly getting a comfortable release on the Sega Saturn, at least in the US, Capcom had a rough time trying to get Sony of America's approval to release the game alongside Mega Man 8. Thankfully, they did release them both. Apparently, Sony of America wasn't too big on releasing 2D games to the West, as they wanted to focus on the 3D graphics that the system was known for. But according to a Capcom spokesperson at the time, it wasn't a personal thing against 2D, it was a score in the system. While 3D gaming was the trend in the late 90s, it was great that certain developers like Capcom and SNK were still making sprite-based 2D games. Kinda funny now, since a lot of those 2D games still hold up well visually compared to 3D games that were trending at the time. The CD consoles allowed games to do so much more, like animated cutscenes, voice acting, better sound quality, adding more detail to the sprites and animation, in which this game provides, for better and for worse. The music was composed by Toshihiko Horiyama, who contributed to many Mega Man titles as well as the Ace Attorney titles. I enjoyed a variety of the tracks in this game, such as Magma Dragoon's theme, Jet Stingray's theme, as well as both the X and Zero version of the opening stage. The other variety is nice, ranging from a jungle, a level set in cyberspace, and one of my favourite set pieces, a train level. The Saturn version even has a nice wave effect in the volcano stage. The sprites and animations are nicely detailed. I love the addition of the after images when X and Zero dash, and the explosions after killing an enemy really hypes up the action. The animated cutscenes look good, giving it a retro anime flavour. No, it does look quite pixelated when displayed on a HD screen. The voice acting though is, well...
What a freak.
Colonel! What?
I'm disappointed in you, Colonel.
Wait, Zero! I'm serious! Please! Brother, please! Don't you remember? Zero saved my life!
Iris! Ah! No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What? What am I fighting for?
It's bad. I don't think the high-pitched feminine voice matches someone named Meta Man. The voices can be a bit hard to hear sometimes, with a few yawn pauses in between lines. Despite the bad voice acting, I have a soft spot for it. Around the time of its release, plenty of games were notorious with bad performances, but I find a lot of them charming and hilarious. I often quote a lot of the lines like,
What do you think you're doing?
It's not too late. Stop the coup now.
and
My fate is sealed. I have no choice.
and of course the infamous
What? What am I fighting for?
Unfortunately, the voice acting triples X4's serious attempt at a story. The previous games had plot, but with the assistance from the new hardware, the team had attempted to dress up the world and its characters. X4 has two campaigns, one where you play as X and the other as Zero. The overall plot is similar in both, as you would still be going through the same stages, but they do have some differences. Firstly, let's start with X. X's campaign begins with an interaction between the new character, the General, the leader of the military Reploid group, the Rapture Force, and a shadowy figure who isn't totally obviously Sigma. Sigma tries to convince the General to go after the humans as they would go after them. However, the General isn't buying his bullshit and dismisses Sigma from the room. During the first stage, Dune, a floating city falls down and is destroyed, leaving a large population dead. The situation of the first stage is a lot more grim than what happened before. After X defeats a giant metal dragon, he meets the Colonel, an important figure of the Rapture Force. X asks the Colonel to come to Maverick Hunter base for questioning, as the Rapture Force were present when Dune was under attack. However, because of the Colonel's stubbornness, seeing that lowering his weapon is a sign of cowardice, refuses, marking the Rapture Force as Mavericks. We then see the General have a speech saying the humans have accused them as Mavericks, and that they are going to build a utopia known as the final weapon, so Reploids can live in peace. Similar to Magneto in the X-Men comics building Asteroid M. The Hunters see them as a threat, so throughout the game you have to stop their plans. Kenji and Afune, who took up the producer role and helped with the writing, wanted to try to portray the Rapture Force as a morally grey group, trying to question the heroes' actions. However, I feel it fails trying to make me sympathise with them in this scenario. The Colonel could have just come in for questioning to prove the Rapture Force's innocence. We could have gotten a scene where the Hunters question the Colonel at the base, and if the Hunters still accuse them as Mavericks afterwards, then fair play. It could have been interesting, but just refusing because of pride and stubbornness just makes this conflict stupid and pointless. Especially since we know that the General was aware of someone who wanted to take down the Maverick Hunters. If you played any of the prior games, then you know that it is Sigma in the beginning of the game and the one who is behind everything. We even find out the one who destroyed Star Dragoon being Magma Dragoon, a former Maverick Hunter earlier in the game, just so he could fight the main characters. It's ridiculous! At the end of the day, Mega Man stops both the Rapture Force and Sigma and calls it a day. One thing I do like now is that the bosses you fight aren't all Mavericks and are members of the Rapture Force, giving you reasons to fight them, like stopping CS Beast from supplying weapons and resources to the Rapture Force. there are only 3 Mavericks you actually fight in X4, being Cyber Peacock, Split Mushroom, and the previously mentioned Magma Dragoon, who all worked for Sigma. Adding Gaillard before the fight fleshes them out a bit more than disappearing like in the previous games, and in the Japanese version they even have unique voice chips before the fights. While X's campaign is another excuse to kick Sigma's ass, Zero's campaign fleshes out his backstory and is connected to a couple of characters in the story. While it was teased in X3 that Zero is a creation of Dr. Wily, we get actual confirmation in X4, as well as Zero being the original Maverick that caused Sigma to go evil. This was also mentioned in the arcade fighting game Mega Man 2 The Power Fighters in Base's Ending, and I believe it will be discussed further in the Mega Man Zero series. Zero's has personal connections to the Colonel and Iris, the Colonel's sister, as well as Zero's love interest. While Colonel was harsh towards X in the opening stage, he seems to respect Zero and thanks him for saving Iris during the Sky Lagoon attack. However, like X's campaign, he still refuses to negotiate with the Hunters and just the same fails and dies by the player's hands. During the final stages, Iris is distressed, seeing Zero kill the Colonel and fights him to the death. Unfortunately, Iris also dies, leaving Zero mourning the loss of both of their deaths. First time seeing this with no prior knowledge of the franchise, as well as being at 8 or 9, this was pretty sad. But now playing the previous games, it didn't leave much of an impression, besides having a funny joke in the Mega Man community. If we knew Iris before this game, saw more of the relationship, as well as good performances, this scene would have hit hard, but it didn't do much for me in the end. The story had a lot of potential, and with the right script and solid voice acting, this could have been a great story discussing what makes a Maverick, but at the end of the day, this is the weakest part of the game. I think if Maverick Hunter X was successful and we got remakes for the rest of the titles, then I think a lot of these issues could have been adjusted to make a compelling story. While the story is bad, the gameplay still holds up today, being just as fun as it was back in the 90s, with a lot of Mega Man's moves still being intact. His dash animations have more frames, so you cannot instantly go into another dash, but you can go just as fast as he did in the previous titles by immediately jumping afterwards and then dash. The upgrades this time are pretty great. The air upgrade doesn't give X an extra jump, but he can either perform a mid-air dash or can hover for a short while, which can be used to reposition yourself in fights and reach new areas. There are actually 2 arm upgrades to choose from, which both can be found in the same area. You can either pick the one that soars 4 charge shots at once, or my personal favourite, the Plasma Charge Shot, that fires a powerful blast and uses multiple plasma balls that do constant damage. The Plasma Shot is so useful in boss fights and can leave a majority of enemies into dust. The head upgrades in the previous titles were usually the weakest part of X's kick. The one in X1 didn't have many opportunities that it can be used. X2 and X3 had an item tracker that was good to find items, but had some drawbacks, with X2 making the player defenseless, and X3 can only be used once at the beginning of each stage. X4 decided to scrap those ideas and instead make it so you fire an endless amount of uncharged special weapons, making the special weapons a bit more useful than if they were limited. The weapons are alright for the most part, though there were some like Frost Tower I only used for enemy weaknesses. Lightning Wave creates a wall that you can walk it off to reach new heights. Rising Fire was useful in a lot of vertical areas. Soul Body was a good shield weapon, creating a hologram in front of you, and Twin Shatter, while weak, covers a lot of areas. The torso cuts damage in half, like it always does, but now allows X to use the Nova Strike, which launches himself in midair and does an invincible dash attack. It is very strong, but it can only be used once before it needs to be charged. By itself, it's not that good. There were some playthroughs that I completely forgot it was a thing, but with my tip, the Nova Strike can be busted. On the character select screen, do these sets of combinations. Make sure you hold the shoulder buttons until the opening scene ends and you are on your X, who has a purple color scheme instead of the light blue color scheme. Enter any capsule and you will unlock the ultimate armor that includes all the upgrades and lets X do an endless amount of Nova Strikes, and man, this move with the ultimate armor breaks the game. Nova Strike does more damage than the boss's weaknesses, making them total pushovers. The bosses are better here than they were in X3, but like X3, they do suffer Spark Mandrill Syndrome, making them incredibly easy. If you aren't using your weakness, then the majority of the bosses are actually fun to fight against, as unlike the previous game, these bosses have a variety of moves that will test your abilities, later before in any order, without too much trouble. New to this game is that you can finally play as Zero properly. While Zero was playable in X3, he did only be used once per stage to not fight bosses, to get power-ups, and if he died, once he was gone for good. But now, Zero is fully functional, just like X, and has his own campaign and his own moveset, gets in the Buster, and fully using his Z-Saber to an excellent melee fighter. A few people say Zero is the hard mode due to the fact that he has to be up front to destroy his foes, and doesn't have many boss weaknesses weapons, but I would say it mostly comes down to preference. Do you prefer a long-range fighter that keeps his distance, or do you prefer to be up close and personal? Personally, I prefer playing as Zero. Unlike X, Zero cannot gain new armor pieces, but he does learn new abilities when defeating bosses, like getting a double jump and a fiery uppercut attack. He was originally going to have an ultimate armor too, but was removed due to time constraints, though a similar design was used in Command Mission and the mobile game Rockman X Dive. Zero's moves don't require ammo besides the digitat he gets from Cyber Peacock, so you can use them as many times as you like, and makes the new weapon tank very useless in his campaign, since the digitat can be refilled when Zero gets hit. There is less backtracking if you pick Zero, since you don't need to pick up the armor parts, giving you more freedom to pick the stage you want. The amount of E-tanks are half, from 4 to 2, and in its place you get a weapon tank that can refill your ammo, and an item that makes you restart with 4 lives instead of 2 when you get a game over. The weapon tank is a fine addition, but with the head upgrade it becomes almost useless if it wasn't for the charged special attacks. Lives are meaningless here. The levels in X4 are divided up into 2 acts, so if you get a game over in the second act, you can restart at the second act. So far, this is the easiest game in the series, but it is also probably the most straightforward, with so far the least amount of backtracking. There were maybe 1 or 2 instances where I had to backtrack with X. While I've criticised the story and voice acting, I don't think the plot was the reason why people enjoy the Mega Man X series. I felt X4 trimmed a lot of fat from X3, making things more streamlined, yet still incredibly fun to play and easy to get into, especially with Zero's new playstyle. This is still my favourite game so far in this marathon, that I feel is a good option to start with alongside the first title. Next time I tackle the 5th installment that almost became the final chapter. If you played Mega Man X4, let me know what you think of it. Until then, take care.
Mega Man, 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 Mega Man! Those platforms falling!
Hey, no fucking shit! They're falling! They're fucking falling! I can see that!
So far, I've been enjoying the majority of the games in the X series. Unlike the games on the first X CTXN, where I played them at least once prior to this marathon, I'm heading to uncharted territory with X Legacy TXN 2, and the first game in that TXN is Mega Man X5. The gap between X4 and X5 is the longest so far, as X5 was released in the year 2000 in Japan and 2001 in the West. However, there were plenty of other Mega Man titles between the two games, including the Mega Man Legends games, as well as Mega Man and Bass. From what I know, X5 seems to be the most diverse, as some people consider it as one of their favourites, and others see it as one of the weakest. But what do I think? Unlike the previous three games, the story already announces Sigma from the get-go. In the intro stage, luring X and Zero into a trap to spread the Sigma virus that causes a majority of Reploids to go Maverick, with Newcomer Dynamo activating the Eraser space colony to crash into Earth. While I'm tired of seeing Sigma, I'm at least glad he doesn't steal the spotlight from anyone else. X and Zero go back to Maverick Hunter HQ to see the damage from the virus outbreak and find a way to prevent the space colony from crashing to Earth within 16 hours. We are introduced to 4 new characters: Aerodragon, Sidness the new leader of the Hunters, Douglas the mechanic, and Lifesaver the medic. To prevent the colony crashing onto the planet, they must activate the Enigma cannon to destroy it. However, in order to increase the odds of destroying it, the cannon needs 4 pieces of equipment, which are gathered by 4 bosses: Tidal Whale, Crescent Grizzly, Silent Firefly, and Volt Kraken. I enjoyed how the bosses in X5 have dialogue with the Hunters, giving them backstories. Unlike the previous titles too, these Mavericks aren't really part of a team, with the majority of them not being strictly evil. Instead, each fight is traded for different reasons, though we find out that X and Zero have poor diplomacy stats, or frequently get nat once on their dice rolls. Tidal Whale believes that the Hunters will harm the ocean if he hands them the hydrogen, and Volt Kraken gets corrupted by the virus while interacting with the Hunters. Dynamo is a new villain, but besides activating the space colony and distracting the Hunters just so the timer can go down, he can be easily written out of the story, since we have no idea what his true motives are. The player has 16 in-game hours to defeat the Mavericks before the colony crashes. Each time you enter a stage, an hour drops, and if the timer runs out, the team fires the cannon anyway. This isn't something to be stressed over, as the timer will only go down once if you clear or leave a stage. It doesn't go down if you immediately restart the stage you died on. The timer itself isn't much of an issue in this game, since you would have plenty of time to wipe out all the Mavericks and find the MacGuffins you need. Like X4, lives are meaningless here, as you always start at the last checkpoint, even if you get a game over, which makes this particular collectible meaningless. There is a chance that the cannon can fail to destroy the colony, and if it does, the team must get 4 parts for the spaceship, which are gathered by the 4 remaining Mavericks: Spiral Pegasus, Dark Necrobat, Spiked Rose Red, and Berlin Dynarex. The spaceship also has a chance to fail, leaning into the bad ending of the game. X5 has 3 different endings, and they all depend on the outcomes of the cannon and spaceship cutscenes. If the cannon or spaceship succeeds, then you get the dead ending. If the cannon fails, then Zero will volunteer to be the pilot, since the autopilot function is damaged, and will attempt to crash into the colony. If the spaceship manages to completely crash into the colony, then Zero contacts HQ to tell them he's still breathing. X and Zero fight, as both X and Lifesaver believe he has gone Maverick, which isn't the case of the dead ending. After the fight, X falls unconscious, and Sigma attempts to finish them off. Unfortunately for him, Zero still stands, making him retreat to the final area. During the final fight, Sigma reveals that Zero was created by Dr. Wily, and that his plan of spreading the virus and crashing the Eraser colony that also had a large amount of the virus was so Zero can awaken to his true self, as Wily's ultimate killing machine. Sigma goes down, but not before trying to take them both down with him. Both the hunters gain critical damages from the attack. However, Zero gives Sigma the final blow before he perishes. X sees his best friend die and is almost on the brink of death, not before Dr. Light heals him up. The ending cuts 3 years after Sigma's defeat, with X holding his best friend Z-Saber and continues the good fight. If you played as Zero in the last battle, he sees his past memories of his creation, as well as seeing Iris before dying. If the spaceship fails to completely destroy the colony, then a good chunk of the colony crashes down, leading to many casualties, and Zero will awaken to his ultimate self, forcing X to fight his best friend. Sigma kills Zero after the fight, but leaves X to live until he remains conscious. This would have been a perfect opportunity to destroy your arch nemesis, where he's totally defenseless. But Sigma has probably lost a few brain cells after being destroyed so many times. Like the good ending, X defeats Sigma and is near on death's door until Light saves him. However, Light erases X's memories of his best pal. The story is a step up from X3 and X4, especially since this was originally meant to be the swan song of the X and Zero story, before leading to the Mega Man Zero series. However, with 3 games afterwards, this was changed. I like the direction of the story, though there are some issues. It feels weird to add new supporting casts at what is meant to be the finale, but the major issue is how you get the endings. Like I said earlier, the 3 different endings all depend on the outcome of the canon and spaceship scenes, but the way to get them isn't dependent on the player's skill, but on random luck. You can increase your stats if you defeat the Mavericks, but the chances don't increase much. During my multiple playthroughs, I never got the canon to actually work, despite beating the 4 Mavericks. And I know you can get it to work because I've seen playthroughs of the game years ago. The canon has a very low chance of succeeding. If you fail the spaceship scene, then you automatically get the bad ending. The chances of failing a spaceship isn't as high as the canon scene, especially when defeating the rest of the Mavericks, but still deciding how the events go on RNG is BS. It's stupid, as even though X2 and X3 did the multiple scenarios too and weren't executed too well, at least it was determined on the player's skill. You also use Zero if you failed the spaceship sequence, so if you were using him throughout the game, then you would have to play as X. Heart tanks don't also stack between characters, meaning if you treated them as Zero and lost them, X would only have a small amount of health that he had at the beginning. There are a couple of heart tanks exclusive to X, since there are areas where Zero cannot reach to try to counter this issue. But this is still an issue, since you would have to go back to the previous stages, at least the energy tank stacked. Just to clarify, unlike X4 where both characters have separate campaigns, X5 allows you to swap between the two during the playthrough, so you can mix and experiment with them to your heart's content. If you're studying on a stage as X, you can swap to Zero for an easier time, or vice versa. Just a warning though, at the beginning of the game, pick X, since if you put him in the intro stage, he gains the 4th armor from X4 immediately, and while you don't have infinite ammo and the Nova Strike ability, the other perks are still intact. It outclasses the default armor. If you put Zero at the beginning, he gets a measly pea shooter, which is weak and he cannot move while shooting. It's like if you were offered an ultimatum to choose either watching Into the Spider-Verse or Boss Baby. There are 2 additional armors, the Fountain Armor and the Gaia Armor. The Fountain Armor allows X to soar into the skies for a few seconds, and once you get it, you can skip a lot of the challenge from the rest of the levels. The Gaia Armor makes X immune to spikes, can keen onto walls, and he has a powerful charge shot. However, his movement, dash speed, and fire range is greatly reduced, and he cannot use special weapons. I only used it to get 1 or 2 heart tanks. You won't be able to use either the Falcon or Gaia armor until you have collected all the parts for that particular set. You also won't be able to use the armor straight away once you got all 4 parts, as the Ike worries for security reasons due to the virus outbreak, which from a story perspective, it probably makes sense, but I found it stupid since you can immediately use the new armors in previous games. I would have preferred if you just got each armor once in 2 stages, instead of going on a scavenger hunt to find both sets, since the individual parts are useless. It would certainly make the backtracking less tedious. You need the Falcon armor anyway, in order to get the majority of the parts, since the capsules can only be found with the Falcon suit. At least it has more use than the rideable mechs in X3. Speaking of X3, X5 has similar problems with backtracking, as in order to get everything, you need to repeat some of the stages. You need to get the Gaia suit in order to get the heart pieces in Sign of Fireflies and Vault Kraken stages, but you need to get the Falcon set first to get the Gaia armor, which the parts are found in those stages. The biggest offender is Tidal Whale stage, which you need to revisit 3 bloody times to get everything. You have to beat the stage to gain Tidal Whale's weapon in order to open the capsule, and then come back with the Falcon or Gaia suit to get the heart tank. You can use 0 to get the heart tank too, but the number of times still remains the same. Tidal Whale stage is also a Yon Ultra Destroyer, and both collectibles are at the halfway point. Most of my playthroughs relatively stay the same in terms of boss order. While you can jazz it up a bit, the weakness route is the most optimal route, requiring the least amount of backtracking. If you want, however, you can immediately enter the final stages without entering the Maverick stages. You will be heavily nerfed, but it is possible. I had more fun not bothering getting everything, and just played casually with the powers you get from the Mavericks, which has a decent selection. The Tri-Thunder is a combination between the Yak Beam from the first Mega Man game and the Scrabble Thunder from 11, which means it's heralded. The charged version of the Crescent Shot creates a shield around X, causing harm to any foe. The Dark Hold is a throwback to Jazzman's Time Stopper from Mega Man 2, and the charged version of the F-Laser fires a large beam that is active for a few seconds. Zero's abilities mostly stay the same, with some slight variations to his uppercut and downward stab, but he also gains some new tools. His air dash makes him invincible that can slightly change his trajectory while damaging foes in his range. The Twin Dream creates a clone of himself similar to Soul Body from X4, but the clone can perform the same moves as Zero, dealing twice the damage. My favourite technique of his is the Crescent Sword, where he also gains access to a double jump and a spin attack, which has a large hitbox that deals a lot of damage, especially towards bosses. You really don't need to use the boss weakness with Zero, since the Crescent Sword is just faster. If you enjoyed playing as him in the previous game, you probably enjoyed them here. The bosses do have Spark Mandrill syndrome, and it's worse with the boss rush portion of the game, since in the boss rush, their health increases to the top of the screen. Their moves don't change, so it just makes fights last longer, especially when going up against Burning Dynamax and Crescent Drizzy, when their invincibility frame lasts for ages when they are hit with their weakness. Thankfully, you can just get the ultimate armor with X with either the cheat code or the third portion of the final stage to cut down the fat. Without their weakness, I found the majority of the fights to be pretty good, especially against Spike Rosered, Tidal Whale and Vault Kraken, offering a variety of moves. 6 out of the 8 stages are also fun to play through with their own unique settings and obstacles. Spike Rosered has these fine sections showing off the rope grind feature, and Sign of Firefly has plenty of horizontal and vertical platforming. X5 does feature some BS stages, being Vault Krakens and Tidal Whale stages. I've already explained why I don't like tidal wave stage, but Vault Tracking starts off with a bite section that has a bottom pit before the ready sign disappears. The first part leaves practically no room for error, as one mistake can lead you to your death. If you want to get the capsule in this stage, you have to get all of these orbs floating around in one go, otherwise you have to restart till you do. In this part, I turned on the rapid fire feature that makes this part of the level a bit easier. The second part isn't any better since you have to do various push puzzles to activate these doors. After the first time, it gets dull. One of the things I don't particularly like about this game is AIA, forcing you to pause and make you listen to the basic fundamentals, which aren't all that useful most of the time. What was supposed to be the final chapter, it was an odd choice to add unskippable tutorials. Like the first time I played X5, it's like whatever, but for every time you want to play, it just becomes redundant, forcing me to math my way through the dialogue. There is even an optional tutorial mode in the menu for players who want to learn the ropes, so I don't know why they added her into the main campaign. Speaking of unskippable dialogue, this game doesn't have any skippable cutscenes, and the only way to end them is to mash on the button. While X4 story is bad, at least you can skip them on repeated playthroughs. I liked X5 story, but if I want a casual session, I'd have to mash my way through the cutscenes, and under X4 with the fully voiced animated cutscenes, X5 just has still images and the beeping noises, and those beeping noises can be a bit irritating after the first time. The music though is fantastic. There are so many greats like Spike Rosethreads, Vault Dragons, and Dark Necrobat Stage. I really get Sonic CD vibes from Dark Necrobat Stage. One of my favourite tracks is the opening track when you boot up the game, which starts off so calm and melancholy, but then gets amped up halfway through, making it feel like the finale. There are even some remixes in this game too, like Tidal Whale Stage is a remix of Bubble Crab Stage from X2. Out of all the X games I've played so far, this is probably the one I have the most inflated thoughts on. It does a lot of things right with the story, the weapons you get from the Mavericks, level design, and this is the first time the characters can crouch. But there is a lot of crossable design choices too, like AIA, the constant backtracking, the RNG scenarios, and the way the capsules were handled. This game is certainly better than X3, but if I want to play a Mega Man X game, I would rather jump back to the older titles. If I ever go back to this one, it would only be for a casual run and not a 100% run. If the other games on the session Galaxy gets in are any fun, then maybe give this one a try. The next game in the franchise I'm going to tackle is X6, which is going to be interesting. Handheld gaming has come a long way since the Game Boy days, with the likes of the Switch and Steam Deck, allowing players to play console quality games on the go, or while chilling on the bed. Even phones can put out some pretty impressive looking titles, but the Game Boy was quite limited in what it can do with its screen size, 8-bit graphics, 2 face buttons, and in the very first model, its lack of colours. Still, that didn't stop developers pushing out their popular franchises onto the lime green machine, and Mega Man was no exception, with 5 games in total, plus 2 X games on the Game Boy Color, with the latter being the subject of today's segment. I haven't touched the classic Mega Man titles on the Game Boy at the moment, but I think it would suit that console since the NES games worked well with only 2 buttons and not being as fast paced to be blind spotted. X, on the other hand, seems like an odd choice considering how fast that game is compared to its predecessor, making it easier to get hit by blind spots and leaps of faith, which both of these games do suffer from. Besides that now, how does Xtreme 1 and 2 fare on Nintendo's pocket-sized device? I want to point out, I do not care for either game's plot. Xtreme 1 has Mega Man X dive into the mother computer to re-fight old Mavericks from the first 2 games with the assistance of the new dyed
mid.
The new characters are so forgettable, now I even forgot the 2 main cronies' names, and spoiler alert, they get overthrown by the big bad of the series, to no one's surprise. They even tried to pull off a sad death scene with its newcomers, which did not leave any impression on me, especially with the loud beeping text that scrolls. Oh, speaking of the plot, you cannot skip them minus the title screen. You can speed it up, but the noise is very loud, especially if you have headphones on. X4 had at least a bad voice performance to be funny. Xtreme 2 doesn't fare any better, being more of an excuse to refight old foes. Xtreme 2 did bring back Iris from X4, which is nice being set before those events. So I would assume that she would have a bit more of a personality, or at least grow her chemistry with Zero, but nope, she's just your standard guide. The plot is not even secondary to my enjoyment of this series, as the main appeal to 2D platformers to me is the core gameplay. Both Xtreme Games are sort of remixes of past titles, or as I put it, demixes, with Xtreme 1 reusing bosses and stages from X1 and X2 with minor changes to the other designs and changing the armor order, while Xtreme 2 also adds bosses from X3, so if you played X1 or X2 then you would be familiar with the level pattern. Firstly, I want to talk about Xtreme 1, as while both games are incredibly similar, they do have some differences. Xtreme 1 includes a normal, hard, and extreme mode, which aren't so much difficulty settings, but rather gives you a different set of Mavericks, with normal containing Chill Penguin, Spark Mandrill, and Storm Eagle from X1, and Flamestad from X2, and hard mode gives you Armored Armadillo from X1, and Will Data, Morph Moth, and Manda Centipede from X2. I think these are decent pits to put on the Game Boy, as these don't have too many pits and insta-kill spikes for you to actually jump into, though there are some. You can transfer all of X's Maverick abilities in normal mode to hard, making hard mode easier. Extreme mode is unlocked by beating the 2 campaigns, and is basically combined with no story elements, so if I ever replaying this game, it would be through the extreme mode. If you were playing these modes back to back, then yeah, it would be annoying, but I assume that these modes were designed to play in different settings rather than binge through it. Still, I think making normal and hard mode separate from the beginning makes it redundant. Transferring the SNES controls to the Game Boy was possibly quite a challenge for the developers, and I think they did the best they could, however I wouldn't say the results weren't that great. In the SNES games, you had the option to press a button to dash or double tap, but here you can either double tap, which is my preferred method, or press the start button to dash, which must have been uncomfortable on actual hardware. You can also hold down the D-pad and press the jump button like the slide move in classic Mega Man, but it's still a bit awkward to use transitioning from dashing to jumping. Wall jumping is also awkward if you get the boot upgrade, as it makes X jump further while jumping off walls, but sometimes I felt that X won't respond in full. You do unlock the Hadouken and Suryuken, which while doesn't kill foes in one hit, are easier for those fighting game amateurs, as you only need to charge your buster and then press down or up respectively to unleash them. I don't have much to say on the first game, it's Mega Man X and X2 on the go. Xtreme 2 is slightly better, as while it does reuse stages from past games too, it does feature some original levels for the X3 Mavericks, which are better than those bland stages. It unfortunately does suffer more with cases of getting hit unexpectedly, particularly if the Mammoth stage, where you can get hit by fireballs that come out of nowhere, and then the final mode you unlock can kill you with one hit. Xtreme 2 does follow the structure of Xtreme 1, with 4 Mavericks in both modes and an Extreme mode, but instead of being toward normal and hard mode, you have an X campaign and a Zero campaign, with Zero being entirely new to Xtreme too. X and Zero both fight different Mavericks in their representative campaigns, and it's kinda cool seeing Zero tread some of the X1 and X2 stages. Zero plays similar to his console counterpart, but I would say he plays worse, as his attacks don't reach as far, leading him to get hit very easily. His attacks do come out fast, and he can move and attack at the same time. Like X, Zero can also get armor upgrades by visiting the Dr. Light capsules, which unlocks 2 strong attacks, as well as a lackluster head and Yed upgrade. X's character is decent, replacing the Yed upgrade from the first Xtreme game with the Air Dash from X3, as well as combining the Charge Shot from X2 and X3. The Charge Shot is strong, but it can be awkward to use, as sometimes I will accidentally do the Spread Shot when I just want to fire out the Charge Shot. If you beat one campaign, you can transfer and convert their Maverick powers to the other characters, which is cool. Xtreme mode also has a new final boss, which sucks, considering how very little space you have and the flashing screen. This game does have quite a few flashing moments, so I advise against playing it if you have sensitive eyes. The final mode also allows you to swap between both characters, like in X7 and X8, allowing you to strategize who to use in any situation. The problem is that heart pickups and Maverick weapons aren't shared, which means one will eventually become inferior later on. Whoever finishes the final blow on the boss will get that ability instead of the other, which alongside making one less powerful also locks you out of certain upgrades if you don't plan ahead. While it's a slight improvement, my criticism of Xtreme 1's pacing still applies to Xtreme 2. There are some cool things here, like the part systems, where you can buy additional perks for each character by collecting DNA cells from enemy drops. These perks can break the game, as you can buy up to 2 or 3 depending on the perk's strength. X can increase his fire speed and power to annihilate his enemies, which can overshadow his weapons he gets from the bosses, which is a shame because the Fire Wave and Tri-Thunder are great tools. The perks aren't unlocked from the get-go, and I'm not sure what the requirement is for them to appear in the shop, but if you get them, then this game can be a cakewalk. Both games are fine, and I imagine that in the 2000s, having a portable Mega Man X game was fantastic. But considering that you can play the older titles on the go now, these games aren't really worth playing unless if you are a die-hard fan of the series, or if you want to fight some of the X3 bosses without playing X3. Still, besides some screen issues where you can die from insta-kill spikes or get hit by incoming enemies off screen, the transition between the Super Nintendo's game's level design, move kits and overall presentation to a tiny less powerful handheld was impressive. I've seen people playing this before, but it wasn't until this year that I played the fabled Mega Man X6. After X5 finished wrapping up, Capcom decided to bring yet one more X game for the original PlayStation before jumping to the PlayStation 2. Mega Man X6 was released less than a year after X5's release in the West, and while yes, that is a very small gap, the space between the Japanese releases was only a year apart from each other. That is still pretty short, but there have been plenty of games in the same franchise that were released a year apart, and a lot of them turned out to be some of the best in their respective series. Heck, we've seen this countless times in the Blue Bombers Odyssey. I've heard this is one of the worst or the worst in the franchise. I remember watching my younger brother play it a couple years back, and he was having a frustrating time. However, I hear some people still enjoy it. How do I feel about this game though? Well, the story is set after the events of X5, but instead of following one of the endings, it instead cherry-picked both the good and bad ending. The bad ending led to the Eraser 20 crashing into Earth, turning Zero into a Maverick, resulting in Dr. Light deleting X's memories of his friend. During the good ending, however, the 20 doesn't crash and X still remembers Zero. X6 instead describes that the 20 crashed into Earth, but X still knows who Zero is. It's jarring to see this. Instead of 3 years, like the dead ending mentions, it's now 3 weeks after the events of X5, where we see a Reploid scientist named Gate searching around the crash site. he discovers a piece of Zero's DNA that corrupts him, leading him to attempt to wipe out humans and weak Reploids off the planet. X wakes up from his sleep by Aya, who instructs him that a robot is causing havoc around the crash site. X fights the robot, however before X can finish it off, we see a ghost of Zero destroy the robot off with a keen CS. After the dose leaves, we are introduced to Hymax, who informs us that the ghost is known as Nightmare Zero, as he is investigating the nightmare phenomena while pitting a fight with X. Hymax proves too strong for our hero, but leaves instead of finishing our hero off. We are then introduced to a new character, Isaac, who describes the nightmare phenomenon, which is a new virus that causes Reploids to turn into Mavericks, as well as perform some other crazy things. Isaac describes that the nightmare virus was caused by Nightmare Zero, who came from the piece of Zero's DNA. Isaac then mentions he has sent out an investigation team to the locations that are heavily infected by the nightmare and wipe out Nightmare Zero, with Hymax leading the investigation. X suspects that Isaac and his team are up to no good, and later on we discover that, yep, they sure are, as they are working with Date with his plans. We find out that Nightmare Zero and Hymax were created by Date by using Zero's DNA. X manages to defeat Hymax and Date in some of the worst boss fights ever. However, we cannot have a Mega Man X game without Sigma stealing the show. Date resurrected Sigma, presumably with Zero's DNA. No, Sigma is still incomplete. By thanking Date, Sigma kills him. Isaac apparently dies too, due to something called the Eraser incident, which is something that happens in one of the Gameboy Color side games. X defeats the incomplete Sigma, and then afterwards, along with his team, attempt to create a cure for the virus during the ending. Oh! We also see Zero. If you defeat Nightmare Zero, then Zero turns out to be alive due to, repairing himself. He dies in both endings of X5, being left with nothing but a torso and a limb. But he seems to magically repair himself. I know he comes back in X2, but in that game he had the assistance of a third party. It is hinted when you interact with a light capsule that Dr. Light repaired him in the finale, but it doesn't outright confirm it. The writers could have explained how Zero came back better instead of a vague hint. I kinda feel that he's only alive because he is the fan favourite character. Zero's ending shows that he goes into a deep sleep, to perhaps get rid of the virus inside him, which may or may not lead to the Zero games. No, there are 2 more games after this. This ending could be after X6 or the later games. I would say that the concept for the story was at least interesting, seeing how the aftermath from the previous game affected the lives of the Reploids and how Zero impacted the downfall of our villain for the game, Date. Date felt as if Dr. Doppler had more screen time and had some connection to one of the main characters, Aya, being a former colleague of his until he was socially outcast by the rest of the Reploids. Besides those 2, I didn't really care for anyone else at all, and even then I wasn't really invested in their relationship, since a lot of their relationship is mostly told through optional content that is quite the grind. It had a few good ideas, but in the end the story fell flat for me, with characters like Isaac who don't go anywhere, retcons the events of the previous game, and bringing dead characters back because of popularity. The many typos doesn't help either. The presentation is overall nice, as unlike X5 with the bleeps and bloops every time the unskippable dialogue appeared, this game has full voice acting. No, only in Japanese, and you can actually skip them too if you don't care for the plot. The music is also considered one of the best in the series too, and while I prefer some of the other games' soundtrack, this one is pretty good. I like Infinity Meridian's stage theme that reminds me of Final Countdown. Still, I cannot listen to some of the songs like Blaze Heatnitz's stage. The song itself isn't bad, but well, Have you ever had a particular song that you don't like because it reminds you of a past bad experience? That's Blade's Heatness theme for me, as every time I hear that damn song, I'm just reminded of how frustrating that level is. The majority of the levels are atrocious. Blade's Heatness is by far the worst level in any X game I've experienced, as the majority of the level is just a mini-boss that appears numerous times. The mini-boss is a bland onion ring that has no animation while moving around. You have to hit its green weak spots, but unless if you have the metal anchor or the ditto cat, you're going to have a frustrating time. One of the encounters in the stage even has an ultra-destroyer fight where the fire is rising and that damn onion ring slowly submerges and re-emerges in the most awkward positions, and trying to hit the bottom 2 weak spots is frustrating. This stage is better with Zero if you have the ditto cat on hand, but it's still a stage that is a slog to get through. Sealed Selden stage finishes before it even starts if you aren't going for the alternate route, and Infinity Virginia stage is a straightforward corridor with only another mini-boss in your way, no, far less annoying. Ground Starovitz's stage is set in a museum with blue totem poles that magically transports you into one of 8 random areas, which means you can easily miss out of one of the light capsules and heart tanks because of RNG. The only stage I thought was fine were the intro stage and Commander Nimark stage, and even then there are insta-kill spites in Nimark stage where you have to make a blind leap of faith. What makes these levels even worse is the nightmare phenomenon, which can cause different effects on the level you play on. In the first game, when you beat a certain Maverick in one stage, another stage would change in some way. Like, if you beat Teal Penguin, then ice would cover the lava in Flame Maverick's stage. That would allow X to get a heart tank. This was something I wanted to come back in the series. Unfortunately, I was bestowed upon a monkey's paw. The first game alters the stages to benefit the player. The 6th game decided to borrow the concept, but to cripple the player instead of rewarding the player. If you played Blade Heatness stage, then Blizzard Wolffang stage will unlock a secret area, but it also causes fireballs to fall down from the sky, which just gets in the player's way. Rainy Territory stage by default has acid rain segments that drains the player's health slowly, and to make it stop, you need to destroy these shields by breaking these small machines. But if Nightmare mode is on, the stage goes dark, making it hard for me to see where I'm supposed to go. The bosses on the stage the Xtreme that are highlighted red are supposed to be when the nightmare phenomenon is on, but even when I entered a stage that wasn't highlighted red, the phenomenon was still activated. First time I was playing the game, I was confused on why this was happening. Apparently, entering a stage on like Commander Nimark beforehand affects Rainy Territory stage. X cannot get through the first fortress stage without either grabbing the blade or saddle armor, or without the jumper part. X5 introduced a part system, which gives the player some buffs like moving faster. It wasn't handled the best in that game, but at least you can beat the game without equipping a part. X6 brings the parts feature back by restoring Reploids. Some Reploids even hold a part if you save them, but they can turn Maverick if the Nightmare virus gets a hold of them, and if they are corrupted, there is no way of getting them back without a hard reset, so that means bye bye to the part you wanted. Every Meta Man title I've played allows you to beat it without any upgrades as long as you know the mechanics, but X6 punishes you for not having the right equipment on you. The armor sets you get now are at least decent. The Falcon armor is back, but unfortunately removes its biggest feature, which is the power to fly for a small period of time. Still, this is the armor you should stick to till you get the others, as playing as default X is near unplayable with how the game is designed around using the air dash ability, which default X doesn't have. The new additions are the Saddle and Blade armor. The Saddle armor is an improvement from the Dire armor, as it's very strong, especially extended attack that can wreck some bosses, can keen onto walls, and can jump onto ceilings. It also looks cool, however it cannot air dash which is needed to get past the second fortress stage. The blade armor, on the other hand, is useful all around, as it can air dash in multiple directions. New to X is the Z-Saber ability. No, unlike Zero's, he only performs a standard swing. Overall, X is nowhere fun to play as compared to the other games he's in. I barely use the Maverick weapons, besides the metal anchor for fighting that blasted onion ring, and the atrocious high max fight, as well as the Yammer option, which I use a lot in crowded areas, as it creates a shield of dragonflies around X while firing projectiles. Zero, on the other hand, is the way to play this game, as he doesn't need to get extra upgrades. Unlike the previous two games though, he needs to be unlocked. Fortunately, he is easy to do as you need to enter one of these blue portals that leads you to an alternate path where you encounter Nightmare Zero. He is easy to beat using X's new Z-Saber attack, and once he's defeated, you unlock the red Maverick Hunter. Zero has a new sword attack animation, and by sword cancelling can wreck Mavericks within seconds. Using a dodge cell as him causes a glitch where it deals damage every second once his Z-Saber is out, making him busted in most boss fights. His dither attack is also useful against those damn onion rings, and his new sword spin attack comes out quick and good for crowd control. His bust assault makes a return and is far more useful than it was in the previous game, being more powerful and comes out faster. A warning though, don't enter the blue portals again after beating Nightmare Zero, as you would have to challenge Hymax, who cannot be defeated with your default weapon, which goes against the mentality of Mega Man boss fights. He is one of the worst bosses I have ever encountered, as you need to fire forward charge shot and then immediately fire a special weapon to damage him. While the reward for beating him allows you to skip to the fortress stages, it's not worth it, as he takes forever to beat. I had to turn on Retro Hunter mode just to get the fight over with. There was one situation at Zero where I accidentally entered a blue portal that led me to him, and since I didn't have a special weapon, I couldn't touch him. You get multiple lives for saving Reploids, and unfortunately I couldn't leave the stage as you need to beat the stage beforehand, so I just had to stand there and let him take away my 9 lives just to return to the stage the Xtreme. Thankfully he's only optional until the fortress stages. I couldn't stand playing Mega Man X6, and the only thing that made it tolerable for me was playing as Zero. I can see why people have a soft spot for this game, especially if you're playing as Zero, who breaks the game, but unfortunately, I cannot recommend this game. If you do want to give it a go, at least get it on the second yellow suggestion if you enjoyed X5 or the other games, but I recommend having Retro Hunter mode on, as the fortress bosses can give you a hard time. I would also recommend turning on the Ultimate Armor mode if you want to play as X, and Black Zero, which automatically gives you the Shock Buffer ability that reduces knockback. I'm kinda hoping that this is the worst of the bunch, but I hear X7 isn't much better. We have finally entered the 6th generation of the Mega Man X games, and the first 3D Mega Man X title with Mega Man X7. This game is rather infamous within the Mega Man community. I think to have suffered enough with X6, and I'm scared to dive into X7 alone. Thankfully, someone is brave enough to join in the review with me.
Hey Tanooki, nice to see you.
Oh hey, another Mega Man fan. Nice to see you too, Aero, and thanks for joining.
So what are you looking at today? Is it a classic game? Oh, maybe you're gonna start looking at Battle Network?
So, how do you feel about X7?
Get me out of here now.
Too late! We've had your introduction. There is no escape.
We're really doing this, huh? This is what I signed up for?
Of course! I've got to compete the marathon. Gotta show the peaks and the valleys. So, Aero, how did you get into the Mega Man franchise, and what made you decide to play X7?
Well, I played Mega Man 2 through 6 on my 3DS way back in 2013 or so, and then branched off into the other series in the years following. It's definitely a favorite series of mine. Of course, I knew I had to play X7 at some point, both because of morbid curiosity and to make my worst Mavericks list way back when. Fortunately, a friend at college had a copy. I do not like this game. At all.
Unfortunately, there isn't much info on X7's development. So, what do you say to jumpstart this review?
Whatever rips this band-aid off faster.
We start off with a CGI cutscene showing the new group of the game, ReploidREVO, as well as a new main character, Axel, showing his copying ability. Axel then defects from ReploidREVO and runs into Zero to be taken into Maverick Hunter headquarters.
Red then contacts the Maverick Hunters in hopes of getting Axel back, but when Axel refuses, Red steps up a wager. He'll release 8 Mavericks in Red Alert's custody, and whoever can catch them first gets Axel. Yep, these guys supposedly had 8 Mavericks just lying around, and just let them go.
Wait, hold up. Aren't those guys part of ReploidREVO?
The story can't even keep itself straight apparently, but that's the least of this game's issues. As it begins, we're in control of Axel. Not the titular X, the new guy. And he's pretty much just an inferior X because he doesn't have a charge shot.
Well, at least he isn't a whiny crybaby.
Why must Reploids fight one another? I've had enough violence.
Yeah, the characterization in this game is, putting it mildly, pretty bad. Though I will say that the intro stage taking place on Central Highway from X1 is actually kinda cool. It even has the Hornet mini-bosses. Nice touch.
Nothing much else happens now. We do get multiple cutscenes for each stage completed, showing Axel's background with his copy ability, and the sinister menace who is absolutely not Sigma. His name is Jeff.
Of course, it's not the stories people tend to talk about with this game, it's absolutely the voice acting. And why is that? Well...
It hurts!
Nice work, Zero.
That's quite enough! You need to back off and pay the dues for your crimes! We've made this mistake time and time again. Why must Reploids continue this accursed cycle of aggression?
You don't know? How could you not know?
Welcome to my silly stage!
Hey, Pumba! Not in front of the kids!
Oh, sorry.
Okay, that's enough of that. Let's move on to how this game actually plays. As Tanooki alluded to earlier, this was the X series' big jump into 3D. Certainly an ambitious endeavor, but it fell flat on its face.
I'm kind of surprised they made a 3D game to begin with, since we already have the Mega Man Legends series, which from what I heard, have turned out good and made the 3D combat enjoyable.
Unfortunately, this game does not follow those footsteps. For one thing, movement is so sluggish, even dashing. You see how slow that is? It's pathetic! And this even affects the 2D segment. You know, what the X series is famous for? Shooting isn't much better since the auto-lock is hilariously fickle, especially when switching targets. And it's weird because there were other platformers around this time that handled it way better. As a perfect example, look at Ratchet & Clank! That was a great game that handled shooting near flawlessly!
I adored Zero in the 2D games, especially being one of the only decent parts of X6. But he doesn't translate well in a 3D environment. The range is pathetic, making you take more damage every time you go up against an enemy, and his attack speed is very slow. No attack cancel here either, folks.
Zero was always one of the most fun elements of this series, and to see him gutted like this, it just makes me sad. So control is slow, shooting with Axel is picky, and Zero just feels off. What about X though? How does he play?
Well, you have to unlock him first.
Excuse me?
Yep. I feel sorry for the poor chap who wanted to play the next Mega Man X game, who saw him on the front cover, and you see this. You have to unlock him by saving a certain amount of hostages, or beat all 8 Mavericks.
What idiot came up with that idea? But yeah, you have to unlock the character the series is named after, and by default, you have to go through at least 4 stages, bare minimum. And when you do get X, well, Axel is effectively out of a job at that point. X's charge shot is enormous and passes right through walls, mitigating a lot of the challenge.
I actually disagree with you there, as by the time I got X in my playthrough, Axel and Zero were already pretty much maxed out in stats. X, while indeed strong, he was fragile as a quid at the start, and you have to go back to the previous stages to get the armor parts, so I didn't bother to end up using him in my playthrough.
Speaking of which, saving Reploids does more than just unlock the character that should be there from the start. Certain Reploids have chips that can be used to augment the hunter's offense, defense, and other attributes. On paper, this is a cool idea, but since the Reploids can be killed by any hazard and you can't see them until they're really close, it's just annoying.
Like in the other titles, X turned their armored parts. However, since he has to be unlocked, you would have to backtrack to the previous stages to get them, since Axel and Zero cannot obtain them for him, which is odd since Zero was able to enter the light capsules in X5 and X6.
Though at the very least, you can use these parts as soon as you find them. The helmet part allows items to be drawn in easier, the arm part allows special weapons to be charged, the body part gives access to the Giga Crash, and the leg part... let's X-Glide. Riveting, isn't it? Definitely a poor armor set, all things considered.
It's odd how you can glide with X by pressing the jump button again, but with Axel you have to hold the jump button before you take off, which caused me a few deaths every now and then, especially in Wind Pro stage with the poor depth perception.
And that's a good segue into the level design of this game, which ranges from mediocre to straight up terrible. The Soldier Stone Kong stage, which is as bland as it gets, Snipe Anteater's level is just hard on the eyes, Bluesky has a bad Ride Stitcher stage, and Flame Hyadarn... yeah, let's move on.
Needless to say, the levels are not fun to go through, being dark and generic, and don't get me started on the bosses.
The bosses are also not fun. They range from completely boring, to frustrating, to Snipe Anteater! Straight up, the worst Maverick fight in the series, and it's not even close! He has complete freedom on the cylinder you're standing on, while you're stuck on the top, and it's incredibly possible that he'll just stick to the bottom and spam attacks. And if you don't have X yet, you know, because you haven't unlocked him yet perhaps, this fight is almost impossible without incredible luck.
Certainly not the Maverick you want to start off with. Most of the Mavericks are also basically damage sponges, and a test of endurance hearing the same lines come out every second.
And how about the weapons you get from these Mavericks? Well, they're all bad. X games usually have a decent selection of weapons that serve different purposes, but the weapons in X7 are either too weak, too slow, or somehow both. The only notable exception is a Splash Laser when charged, which is the most powerful weapon in this series for some reason.
On the plus side, at least you can use the default weapons to defeat the bosses.
You know, Tanooki, I really don't like this game. Do you mind if I go in full rant mode just going over other details I can't stand?
Sir, knock yourself out.
Okay, let's start with basic platforming. It can be a total nightmare at times because of how unhelpful the air dash can be. This is especially true whenever enemies are around because the knockback in this game is absolutely ridiculous. Especially in stages like Wing Chrome Ray and Flame Hyadarn, it's all too easy to get cheap shotted by an enemy and fall to your doom. Speaking of doom, if one hunter dies, then you just lose a life instantly. You can tag between the two hunters at any time, but if one dies, you're just straight up out of luck. This is further compounded by how nearly impossible it can be to dodge attacks at times, meaning all those pot shots are going to add up fast. That is, unless you choose to ignore most of the enemies when the 3D environment allows for it, because yeah, that's a thing in a lot of stages. And don't even get me started on the fight with Red near the end of the game. Game may be worse, but this fight is absolutely horrendous because it's all too easy to fall to your death either from the stiff controls or Red knocking you off. Why the fight with Sigma is way easier than this, I will never understand. This game is just absolutely horrendous!
Wow. I know I dissect the game, but I didn't realize how much you hate it.
Sorry, I just needed to let that all out. This game is part of one of my favorite series in gaming, and it's not just bad, but also backwards in a lot of ways. The uninspired Mavericks, the weak platforming, the capability of just ignoring most enemies, this doesn't feel like the Mega Man X series I know and love. And this is coming from someone who has X6 as a guilty pleasure.
For me, X7 was trying to convert a well-known 2D franchise into a 3D game. However, unlike Legends, the developers failed in this regard. The shoulder buttons are used to rotate the camera instead of using the right analog stick, which is a poor choice for the time of the game's release. Plus, the audio bouncing is quite a mess, with the constant audio cues from the bosses to no sound effects when you pick up heart tanks.
I will say though, for how much I despise this game, I do really like the boss theme. That is one sick jam.
Well, it was nice for you to set up. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. And if your viewers are interested in more gaming content, maybe they can swing by my channel.
I'm sure they would enjoy your content, especially your Maverick videos. Thanks for suffering through this game with me.
Happy to help. Well, this is Aerodragon, signing out.
Next in line is the final X game in the series, with Mega Man X8. And hopefully, the series ends with a bang. I've had my ups and downs with the X series throughout this marathon, but now we're on the final chapter with Mega Man X8. Originally released on the PlayStation 2 in 2004 in the US and 2005 in Japan and Europe. It was also released on the X Genesis PlayStation 2 on all modern platforms, which is the version I played it on. Out of all the games in the mainline series, this is one I knew very little about, even as far as the general reception of the game, since I think X7 did a heavy number on the series that the sales were vastly lowered compared to its predecessors, and according to the Tottenham Shore, X8 was released with a limited amount of slots, probably due to the low sales of X7. I even tried researching for this title, both online and looking at the official Mega Man and Mega Man X works, but unfortunately I didn't find anything substantial. Is X8 a great finale to the X saga, or is it just as bad as the last two games? So, after the bombardment of Maverick attacks, the humans got tired and decided to fund the Data Project, which will make them leave the planet and go to the moon, using an orbital elevator. Kind of a weird thing to go to space now, since I thought space travel already existed in this world, as we see the space stations in X4 and X5. During the night patrol, X witnesses an accident on the elevator. No one was injured. We are introduced to a new character, Yumine, who is a part of a new generation of Retroids that have the ability to copy other Retroids at will, including Sigma, and supposedly are immune to their Maverick. But there's a load of tomfoolery. We are then cut to the opening stage, titled Noah's Park. This game has a lot of not subtle religious references. Anyway, during the opening stage, we encounter that Yumine is kidnapped by Vile, who hasn't appeared since '96, where he died. Robot death is a strange concept in this universe. Nothing really much happens in between stages besides finding out that Axel, who has returned from the previous game, was the prototype for the new Retroids, and that Sigma is back for the 8th time, to no one's surprise. X, Axel, and Zero defeat Vile and Sigma, but unlike the rest of the titles, Sigma isn't the main antagonist, as Yumine turns out to be the true mastermind. No, has the same motivation, which didn't impress me much. The trio defeat Yumine, however before he is gone for good, a weird, shadowy tentacle attacked Axel, making him unconscious. Whatever happened to Axel after that? Who knows, as the story ends with the three heroes descending from the elevator to return home, which is the same as being the final game of the X saga. We don't see what happens afterwards. Axel is currently stuck in a coma as far as I'm aware. I wasn't invested in the plot, which might be because besides the first two games and X5, I lost interest in the overall story, despite enjoying the Mega Man lore. Despite my disinterest for the plot, I will say that the voice performances are a lot better, which isn't saying much as the series were notorious for the bad voice acting. X4 still has a special place in my heart though.
No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What am I fighting for?
Mark Garfer does a solid job voicing X, making him sound more mature and professional compared to his predecessors. Axel is now voiced by Jeffrey Watson, and Zero is voiced by Lucas Gilbertson, and they do a great job too. Lucas himself is quite close with the Mega Man community, interacting with his fans, and appearing in various Mega Man related podcasts. I even found out that according to my mutual YouTube pal Aerodragon, he even reacted to the Iris death scene from X4, doing a better performance. The main cast returned for Command Mission and Maverick Hunters, but after that, both Mark and Lucas retired from voice acting, with Lucas forming his own indie game studio named Yap Yak. The characters were redesigned by Tatsuya Yoshikawa, who is known for his character designs on the Breath of Fire series, Yuken Seeker and Finna. I prefer the older designs, but I would say they look good in motion, at least in terms of gameplay, as they look robotic in cutscenes.
Pun entirely intended.
The environments are quite varied too, with the opening stage being set in a jungle covered with waterfalls and wildlife, as well as a sky fortress, though the usual ice and fire levels are still intact. The outdoor stages are usually a hit for me, but there are a couple of duds. X8 ditched the 3D gameplay, only carrying the 3D assets, and returned back to its roots as a 2D platformer series, which thank goodness, as the characters feel just as good as the older titles. Each stage usually has their own unique gameplay feature, which for the majority of the time work, like in Booster Forest, where you can control a ride armor through the majority of the stage, as well as in Pitch Black, which is one of the better uses of stealth in a non-stealth title, as you must avoid searchlight, otherwise a bunch of Mavericks come out. The duds are the 2 rideable bike levels, which isn't a surprise, as besides the one from X2, are all bad. The stage titled Dynasty has you tail a Maverick named Dinnerbolt Manowar, who has plotted bombs throughout the city, as you need to catch up to him before the bombs go off, which can be beaten under a minute. The other stage is called Central White, which is way too long, especially with the mini-boss that appears 2 times that takes forever to take down. And it is made worse as if you don't have X in your party, then you have to replay the entire stage as him if you want to get the Light Capsule. I don't know why they don't allow anyone else to enter the Light Capsules, as you could do that in X5 and X6. It would be yes padded. All 3 characters return from the previous game, with X and Zero playing fundamentally the same, though with some new stuff. X gains additional armor parts like usual, with 2 sets. The Icarus armor that focuses on attack power and aerial abilities, and the Hermes armor which focuses on mobility. Unlike the previous armor sets, you can mix and match the parts, so if you want the powerful laser from the Icarus Buster part, but you also want the double running speed and invisible dash from the Hermes foot part, you can do that. It's a lot of fun to mix and match and see what parts work for a particular stage. If you equip all the parts from one armor set, you get the benefits, like if you equip all the Icarus parts, you are able to use the Dinner Attack. Zero is able to get multiple optional weapons throughout the journey, like a hammer, lorgnettes, and one of my personal favourites, the spear, which has an insane reach useful in certain stages, like Optimal Sunflower stage, which acts as an enemy rush. I mostly stuck to the Z-Saber, the spear, and the secret powerful weapon throughout my playthroughs. I used a hammer to get one particular collectible. This is the first time Axel becomes playable in a 2D game, so some of his abilities were altered to work in a 2D space. Instead of automatically yachting onto an enemy, Axel is able to rapid fire in all directions, but he cannot fire through walls and has to remain still. He is useful when fighting an enemy from above. Axel also gains the ability to hover for a brief period of time, and can also copy enemies with a similar build to him, although I never really found copying enemies useful besides getting a collectible or 2. Besides Zero's abilities, I didn't find the Maverick powers to be useful, besides in boss fights. The only ones that I use frequently is the Diamond Drift, which fires 2 shots diagonally, freezing enemies, but this can be overshadowed with the Hermes Buster part, which I think is why a lot of X abilities, especially in the later games, aren't all that fun. In Classic Mega Man, the powers you get from the Robot Masters were, for the majority, the only offensive upgrades you got, so they felt special and helpful to use in a lot of situations. Whereas within each new Mega Man X game, you have a lot more choices that are a lot more useful, faster, and powerful than the abilities you got from the bosses. Wherein each new installment, these Maverick powers get overshadowed and seems to be there because it's part of the Mega Man Bible. And despite X7's flaws, it had some good ideas, like swapping between 2 characters, which is back, and has been improved since now you don't automatically die unless if you fall off the stage, or if you touch the nefarious spikes, and instead switch to the other character if you use all your health. Like a majority of tag team fighters, you can gain a piece of health back if a character has their health marked red, which can be useful and has saved my skin in some boss encounters. This can make the game a bit easy, especially if you have energy tanks, but I think it's a neat addition if we are going with the multiple characters route. I would say I would rather have all 3 characters in one level, so that would make backtracking less tedious, but I guess it would make the game even easier. There's a super move which can be activated with a trigger button that calls upon your partner to do a powerful screen neutral attack, but you have to be in range of the enemy. This can make bosses easier to fight. The boss gets in is pretty good this time, and maybe one of the better ones in the series, as they have a wide range of patterns and even a second phase similar to X2. Heart tanks and energy tanks do not appear in stages anymore. Instead, energy tanks can be purchased through the shop, as well as permanent health upgrades for each character. My issue with the heart tanks in the last couple of games is that they didn't stack with all the characters, and while I think they should have made heart tanks as collectibles that benefit all the characters, I think this is a decent alternative. The shop not only provides health and energy tanks, but also other upgrades like new weapons for Zero and shock absorbers. This is also where you can get retry chips, which is the only way you get lives, and if you use all your lives, then you have to restart the entire stage. Besides the central white and BurnCrowSP stage, the levels aren't that long, and while you cannot gain retry chips in the actual stage, they are pretty cheap in the shop. I don't like how you can only purchase up to 5 retry chips, but this is more of a nitpick than anything. So, how do you get currency, and what collectibles do you get from the stages? Well, chips are the currency that you can easily find by defeating enemies and just playing through the game. The only collectibles you get are the light capsules, which I previously mentioned, and rare metals. Rare metals are hidden in each stage that unlock certain items in the shop, like weapon tanks. Some rare metals are easy to get if you just explore, but there are some that unfortunately require certain weapons, characters, and abilities, which require backtracking, especially if you didn't pick the right character. Some of these rare metals are extremely hidden and can only be obtained with X Crystal War after beating Earth Trilobite. I actually had to use a guide for some of these, as I wouldn't know where to use it. BurnCrowSP stage has one where you need to use Zero's hammer on an ordinary flat surface, and then use X's Crystal War to get it up. But there's also one where you need to use Axel's copy ability. While this has annoyed me in some Mega Man X titles since the upgrades don't stack in a new playthrough, it didn't bother me much here, and for that reason is New Game Plus, which allows you to transfer all your upgrades besides Maverick powers you collected. X8 was designed to be replayed, so each playthrough can feel fresh, and while you can stack around to get everything in one playthrough, X8 is like, take your time, you can always come back to it. The game can be beaten with no hassle if you don't get certain upgrades. In one playthrough you can focus on X, and in another you can focus on Zero or whoever. Not even some pretty cool secrets like the ultimate armor and new characters. No, the new characters require a lot of grinding. Mega Man X8 is a step up from X6 and X7. It is probably in the upper half of the Mega Man X games, focusing on replayability. It does have its faults with some collectibles being too hidden, the bite levels, and a mediocre finale, but overall it's a solid experience. It's such a shame it came after the likes of 2 notorious games, as well as tons of Mega Man titles around the 2000s that overshadowed it. If you want to try it out, then the X Odyssey Texan 2 is a good way. Speaking of the Texan, I would say the contents are a mixed bag, with X5 and X8 being decent experiences, to downright bad with X6 and X7. I would say pick it up if it ever goes on sale, which it normally does if you want to play these two games. The first X Texan is a good bundle with only one miss, but I wish all 8 games were in one package. After 2 years of playing through the series, it was enjoyable despite its ups and downs. In the future, I would like to tackle more Mega Man games like the Zero, the Battle Network games, and maybe even Command Mission. The PlayStation Portable was home to some remakes of old classic games, like Dragon X Chronicles, as well as the Tactics Ogre remake. Even the Blue Bomber himself got 2 remakes, Mega Man Powered Up and Mega Man Maverick Hunter X. Maverick Hunter X is a remake of the first installment in the X sub-franchise, and apparently was planned to be a reboot of the series, but due to poor sales, this never happened. My guess is that there were a ton of Mega Man games that were made throughout the 2000s that some folks probably got tired of seeing a Blue Bomber. Oh, how times have changed. I'm usually in the crowd that prefers remakes of titles that had noticeable flaws that had the potential to be better, rather than games that were beloved that still hold up years after their initial release, which I think the original Mega Man X still does, but remaking beloved titles seem to work well on most occasions, and Maverick Hunter X is a fun game. The story is pretty much the same as the original, with a few differences. For one, this game included the Day of Sigma prologue OVA, once you beat the campaign that was included in the X and Dr. Kane seems to have died in that film, changing the events of future titles, if the reboot timeline continued. The rematch fight against Vile is now in the third stage of Sigma's Fortress as opposed to the first. In fact, the Sigma stages are completely original. Besides the Sigma Fortress courses, all the other stages are identical to the original. No, the armor parts have been arranged in different orders, that the Yed parts are now in Flame Mammoths as opposed to Teal Penguin stage to throw off veteran players. It's a nice change. Now if you're trying to go through the optional run, then you will be revisiting stages more. One of my criticisms with the original game was that the dash had to be unlocked, which I felt was essential to play X, and I hope they debuted the dash at the start of the remake, but sadly this was not the case. The game includes a hard mode, which was fun as instead of just making enemies stronger, the bosses have new moves that caught me off guard the first time. I even died to Teal Penguin by his ice shotgun move. For the first time, Vile is playable and he's someone to get used to, as he isn't as mobile as X with a reactive dash button, which makes it harder. Vile does get power-ups like X, Beaten and Mavericks, but it's handled differently, as instead of getting a single power-up, he gets a few for his arm, cannon and feet, but you cannot equip all of them at the same time, as you can only equip a few per stage. Still, having a different character is more than welcome. It sucks knowing that throughout his campaign, you'll be listening to the same track over and over again. Not that it sounds bad, as it suits the overall series, but I wish it just played in the opening stage, as opposed to the overall run. Speaking of the soundtrack, it's pretty good, keeping true to the source material, but maybe it's my overall bias, but I think I prefer the original. There are some tracks I do actually prefer over the original, like the first Sigma's Fortress stage, sounding more intense, like things are about to go down. Same with the visuals, going for 3D models, which makes sense, since they wanted to show off that the PSP can do 3D graphics on a handheld, but I think the pixel art of the original is timeless. The visuals look pretty good if you were playing them on actual hardware, and the character portraits look keen. The voice acting is decent too, bringing back the voice actors for X0 and Vile from X8, and I think X's voice actor Mark Garfer is at his best here, probably even the best voice actor for the Blue Bomber so far. Overall, I think Maverick Hunter X is a pretty faithful remake, being as comfortable to play as the Super Nintendo original, but adds new stuff to keep veterans entertained. I don't think it replaces the original in any way, but if you played the original numerous times and want something a bit different, then you can't go wrong with this game. Sadly, this was the last X game to be made besides Mega Man X Dive Offline, released in 2023. It is a shame because I think Maverick Hunter could have been a starting point to make the stories of future titles way better by sorting out the issues ahead with them. Despite being a story about robots' rebellion against humans, there is a distinct lack of human characters that could have made the conflict of Mavericks, Reptiforce and the Hunters more compelling. The only humans that we only see in the X universe are Dr. Kane and a couple people in the Day of Sigma OVA, and even then, they hardly have any presence. As for the gameplay, the X games have been quite a roller coaster, ranging from amazing with X1 and X4 to X6 and X7 being absolutely terrible that I would never go back to. I replayed most of them after I made videos about them, and I think my opinion on them is pretty much the same. I even replayed X3, but instead of the Super Nintendo version, I tried out the PlayStation version, and besides the soundtrack being slightly better, I still don't like it. The load times are bad in the PS1 version. After replaying some of these games, I've noticed that these games are slightly better if you play it more casually instead of going out your way to get every single upgrade. I don't think we get a new X game anytime soon. No, that doesn't bother me as much, as I still see many of its influences in many platformers today. Some of the staff members who worked on the older titles also helped create the Gunvolt games. If we do ever get a Mega Man X game, there are some things I do want to change. Firstly, I want Sigma gone for good. Like, his influence could still affect other villains in some way, but I think his presence was unnecessary after the second title. I know Dr. Wily shows up in every classic title, but X is more of a narrative-focused game than the classic era that already has tons of villains that can be used. Second of all, I wish we can cut down on upgrades and items, as I've noticed a lot of them overshadow the core mechanics of the game, being the robot powers you get from defeating bosses. As I've watched them in my own time, I will say I've improved a bit since my first video of this retrospective, presented myself better, and I noticed that my writing has improved too, explaining my points better. I will say out of all the videos I did for this retrospective, my favourite was the collaboration I did with Aerodragon on Mega Man X7, and I would love to collaborate more on future projects. While my experience with the X series had its fair share of ups and downs, I'm glad that I did play them. I don't think this will be the last time either talking about the Mega Man franchise, as I would love to talk about the sub-series or ones that I didn't cover, like the Mega Man X RPG. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective, and I would love to know what are some of your favourite Mega Man X games. What is your favourite Mega Man sub-series? I would love to know which Mega Man series you want me to tackle in the future. Until then, thanks for watching.